So, on to China. Our final panel discussion. We're going to focus on the China-American relationship as being the pivotal relationship in the 21st century. And my understanding is it's going to examine cooperative security options existing between these two powers, or the potential for them to exist. Chairing the panel is Martin Lies, who you will remember already spoke at the session on human safety and sustainable security. Dr. Lies also possesses deep experience in working with China. He established the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development in 1991, and he's now a senior advisor to the Chinese government on climate change and other issues. Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. When I speak on China, I always like to start by saying that if you ask a minister if he understands what's going on in China, he'll tell you no. So you can't really be an expert on China in any real sense of the word. It is a complex, wonderful country, and we just do our best to understand the parts of it that we are in contact with. And there are people in this room like Carl Hahn, who spent decades going in and out of China, or Khalid Malik, who lived there, I think, for 10 years in a senior position. So I'm not sure that I'm the right person for this, but I've been landed with it, so I will do it. In any event, this is a different kind of discussion from the ones we've had so far, in that we're focusing on one very particular relationship. And I would say that I have to disagree with Francis, because at the end of that sentence about the pivotal relationship for cooperative security, there is a question mark. That is to say, it's a question. Is it the pivotal relationship for future security? And if so, what does that imply? I personally think that it probably is, but the world is a complicated place, so we must be careful. In any event, what I propose to do, we've lost some time already, but what I would like to do is to introduce the panel that you see here first. Then I have been asked to say a few words from my point of view, if you bear with me, and then we will give the panelists each the chance to give their intervention, then to give some comments and have some questions from the floor. And as we started a bit late, I will ask the indulgence of our leader to be a few minutes late if necessary, so we can get more questions from the floor on such an important matter. So who is the panel? Well, the first point I'd make is it is an astonishingly strong panel with in-depth knowledge of China, which is quite remarkable. And I'll start by saying there is an additional member we're fortunate to have on the panel. The gentleman on the right from you is David Firestein, who is a vice president of the East-West Institute for China, Russia, and the United States, which is an interesting combination of responsibilities. He has been for many, many years, or was a diplomat for the State Department, and 5 years posted in China. And he speaks fluent Mandarin, so he's obviously somebody who understands these questions very deeply. He has written 3 books and many, many articles, and he is proud to say, and he asked me to say, or he told me, that he is the first United States columnist to be retained by a Chinese newspaper, namely the Beijing Youth Daily, which is a very eminent daily, which is read not only by youths. In any event, that is the new edition, and we're very happy that you've been able to join us, David. Then the ones that you have seen on your program are, first of all, Dr. David Finkelstein, Vice President and Director of CNA China Studies, who focuses in a long career on China, and particularly now on US-China relations, China's changing role in the world order, and emerging trends within China. So that's a pretty good background for our discussion. He is a retired military officer who has collected a PhD on the way and has taught at West Point and been in a number of important positions. He has been advisor at the Pentagon and to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on China-related issues. So he has seen these issues in a major strategic role. And more importantly, at least for me, he's the author of and co-author of many books, but he's also a student of Chinese history. And as Santayana said, as we know, those who will not learn from history are condemned to relive it. So we're glad to have a historian on our panel. I now have pleasure in introducing you to somebody you've heard in action several times already, a most remarkable person, Chas Freeman. And I won't go through his whole career, otherwise our time will run out. But I would say he is the President Emeritus of the Middle Eastern Policy Council with a very strong, long background in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, a former US Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, former US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, so he knows something about oil, principal American interpreter for the Nixon visit. So that is practical history, that he was there when this all happened, and we're privileged and hope to hear a little bit from you about that. And he was involved in setting up the liaison office of the United States in Beijing in '73 and was deputy chief of mission in Beijing from '81 to '84. He also has an African dimension to him and many other responsibilities across the panorama of international affairs. He's now an active chair of a company called Projects International, which is developing business all over the world, and he also has written numerous books, and I commend them to you because he writes in a style which makes you want to read them. Then the last member of our panel, last but by no means least, is the only Chinese on our panel. So she represents 1.3 billion people, which makes her very important. She is a visiting scholar at Carnegie's Asia program and is very expert on US-China relations and multilateral architecture in East Asia. And the multilateral architecture in East Asia is changing very fast. She's senior associate at the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a very important institution, and editorial assistant for American Studies Quarterly. She also is the author of books and many, many articles. So you will see that we have a remarkable panel, and I'm sorry we have so little time to make use of them. Let me now quickly move on and just say a few words to start the ball rolling and to give you a perspective. I would say, if you look at history, that conflicts arise for many reasons, but one part of it is simple failure to understand the other. And George Polk was just explaining that to us in clearer terms. And there's a very serious risk of failure of understanding, notably between the United States and China. Their intellectual and cultural traditions are radically different, and it would be very easy to misunderstand. And I hope our panel can help to give you a better understanding. Let me give you a few points of perspective from my point of view. I first went to Beijing in '78, which was quite early on, not as early as some of our colleagues, but early enough. And there were horses and carts going through Tiananmen and Chang'an. This was a developing country, and every time you met a minister, he would say, "We are a big, poor country." That was the almost regular start of any speech. If you go there now, you wonder, you're just struck with admiration because it looks like Times Square. Whether you like it or not, that's another question. And that has all been achieved in 30 years. And 30 years is not a long time in Chinese history, even if we may consider it in the West to be a long time. But to do that in 30 years is astounding. And when you go there and you feel the dynamism, it's different from reading about it or seeing it on the television. It is an amazing world in construction, and I was very privileged to see it happening. So we must first of all acknowledge the speed of change, and that makes difficulties simply because you're changing so fast. Secondly, what you have to remember is the scale of the country. Now, the US is big, but I must say China is bigger. And 1.3 billion people sitting on 10% of the land mass of China, so very concentrated where they are, that's a very big management problem. And the leadership in Beijing has no illusions about the difficulty of trying to guide the development of 1.3 billion people. So we have to remember the scale, and there's one practical implication. It is that you can discuss very exotic ideas in Beijing, and the leaders will understand you and agree with you. The problem they have is to get these ideas translated into reality across a country of that size. And any minister will tell you his problem is execution at the ground level on all the issues we're talking about. So we have to be sympathetic that it isn't easy to make change in a country of this scale. To give you an idea of the scale of the problem, Wu Yaoshao, who's president of the Chinese National Committee on Aging, population ages fast and the numbers are enormous. The elderly population made up 5% of the total in 1982, 5% in 82, 10% in 1999, and it increases by 100 million people every 10 years. And by 2030, China will be what you would call an aging society. But the scale, 100 million a year, a decade, that's a lot of people. So I wanted to make that clear just to give you the idea of what we're talking about. And the second thing is, when we talk about this China-US relationship, we must remember that this relationship is changing in a context of rapid transformation in the world economy far beyond this particular relationship. To give you some figures, McKinsey, who does very serious analysis, it may be serious and wrong, but at least it's serious. They say, looking ahead to 2050, the PRC will have an economy running at 48 trillion. The US will have an economy running at 39 trillion, India 33, and Brazil 11. You don't have to agree the figures, but the point is clear that China is going to become the largest economy in the world. And that's a very important factor to bear in the back of your mind. So those are just a couple of points to position this. And then let me just say that we have talked in this conference about three aspects, basically, of security, which we have tried to integrate, which are related to economics, environment and resources, and, of course, security. As far as the economy is concerned, you only need to know one thing, namely that the Chinese have been doubling the size of their economy roughly every 8 or 9 years. And if you think about that, you can understand their problem when I tell you that means that in 20 years you have generated 3 additional Chinese economies. That's the scale of what we're talking about. And if you improve your energy efficiency by 4.5% a year, which you do, energy intensity, you're still going backwards because your cake is getting bigger even if you're improving your marginal efficiency. That is their fundamental problem. And the factors which enabled them to do this, cheap labor, open trading system, flows of FDI, government and people accepting environmental degradation, and energy and natural resources available to fuel this growth, these are now beginning to become much more difficult. Labor prices are going up, as we have heard. The society is aging. They are suffering now from environmental and social issues, and the global markets on which they rely are now unstable and at risk. So the economic prospects for China, like for everybody else, are complicated. And I will just say one more thing and then turn it over to the panel, namely about environment, where I have been working with the leaders since 1990. They have understood that their future depends on solving their own environmental problems, not because the West is telling them to do it, but because they need to do it. And that applies particularly to climate. They have a remarkable climate strategy integrated across the whole government, and they have given it to the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, to manage. So climate and environment are not add-ons to economic growth, but an integrated part of their whole strategy. And my final point is the following. If I know what I've just said to you, then believe me, the Chinese leaders know it. And they understand that the path of growth which they are on is running them into massive problems. And being practical people, they therefore conclude that they should do something else. And they're doing it. They have adopted a program to reorient the whole Chinese economy onto a different path, which will be less environmentally damaging, more equal, reduce inequality, and better regionally balanced. And the 12th five-year plan precisely explains how they're going to do that in investment terms. They are focusing on 4 crucial areas, one of them education, which means hundreds of millions more people trained as engineers and scientists, innovation, research and development to move up the value chain and compete in new areas, green technology, which they see as the wave of the future, and infrastructure. And the interesting thing is these are exactly the 4 issues where the US is having trouble. So if you look in the long run, These are the issues on which the future will be determined. Anyway, I wanted to give you that broad economic and environmental background before we move now to David Finkelstein. And I believe, David, that you are now ready to correct me and to educate us all. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and many thanks to the Carey Foundation and to the East-West Institute for having the vision to put on this important conference. And thank you for that generous introduction. I look forward to meeting whomever that chap is later on. Recently in China and the United States, there have been various commemorative activities to celebrate the 40th anniversary of President Nixon's trip to China, and Chaz maybe will tell us about that since he was on that trip. But apropos of this particular panel, it's worth remembering that it was security issues at the start of the Cold War that kept our two countries isolated from each other for 30 years, and that it was shared security concerns and not economics that brought the two back together again and resulted in the Nixon trip. So security issues have been fundamental to the U.S.-China relationship since its inception over 3 decades ago, and security affairs are still prominent in the relationship between the two countries, as well as between China and the rest of the world. Now today, however, 30 years later, there is a brand new context, and Martin alluded to it, a new context, at least for the Chinese, in which they are seeking to secure their national security interests. And what I'd like to do with my few moments is suggest to you 4 aspects of this new context that I think will affect security relations between not only China and the U.S., but between China and the other nations with which it does business. So the first major point I would offer to you is that Beijing's national security interests have expanded and become globalized to an extent unprecedented in the history of the People's Republic of China. Now, this may seem like a blazing flash of the obvious, but sometimes even the obvious deserves some admiration and attention. And I think we all understand the basic reasons why China's national interests have expanded. There are 4 in particular for me that stand out. First, of course, is the globalization of China's economy. Second, the impact of Beijing's decade-old going out strategy. Third, the PRC's expansive international footprint as a result of the first 2 factors. And fourth, finally, China's increasing need for resources from overseas. Now, PRC leaders are very much aware that they have entered terra incognita, that never before have Chinese national security interests been so globalized, and never before has China's domestic well-being and its external affairs been so inextricably linked. So while PRC leaders still like to describe China as merely the world's largest developing country, China is also, in fact, an international actor of rising consequence on myriad of issues around the globe. So what's the implication of this? Well, first, the U.S. and China now deal with each other on security topics that go way beyond the original bilateral agenda, and our security interests are intersecting in new and complicated ways all over the globe. If you were to go down a list of the current administration's to-do list of security affairs, you would find a China factor in almost all of them. So consider Pakistan, China factor. North Korea, China factor. Iran, China factor. Nuclear proliferation, climate change and clean energy, China factor. And of course, a global financial crisis, China factor. And actually the same can be said of China. Beijing also grapples with the ubiquitous America factor in many of its most important security concerns. Issues for Beijing such as the global and regional security architecture, the international financial system, the Taiwan issue, a matter of intense sovereign concern to Beijing, as we know, their own energy security, and international trade, and so forth, all of which underscores the point that in a globalizing world, you don't get to choose your dance partner. More often than not, your dance partner is chosen for you. So that's my first major point. My second major point about new context is really a bureaucratic issue within China itself. China's national security interests have expanded, I think, faster than the capacity of the Chinese party state to manage them as effectively as they would like or others need them to. And this is, in fact, a challenge not only for China, but a challenge for other countries as well. And there are three key stressors, I think, on the Chinese foreign policy and national security policy-making system. The first is stressed organizational capacity. Organizational capacity in this case meaning the ability or the lack of ability of institutions to perform their assigned functions given their structure, their personnel, their procedures, or experience and training. And in many ways, the poster child for stressed capacity, I think, these days is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the poor Ministry of Foreign Affairs. A major new challenge for the MFA is just merely dealing with the millions of Chinese nationals that now travel abroad annually. This is an organization that didn't have consular requirements as we think of them 30 years ago. According to the MFA's own figures, as of 2009, there were 47 million overseas trips by Chinese nationals in that year alone. Between 1949 and 1979, there were only 280,000 trips by the MFA's own figures. And they also have to deal with the hundreds of thousands of laborers from China who now work in state-owned enterprises in many of the world's worst neighborhoods. And so I'd like to point out that in 2011, 35,860 PRC nationals had to be evacuated from Libya, the largest single group of foreign nationals that had to be taken out of that country. And, even though the Chinese military, the PLA, is making impressive strides in modernization, if you talk to their senior military officials, they'll complain about the fact that China's expanding national interests have outpaced their institutional capacity to handle a widening set of traditional and non-traditional security missions. So we have this institutional capacity of the system is being stressed because interests are expanding faster than institutions' ability to manage them. A second stressor on the system, frankly, is the trouble that the party-state system still seems to have in coordinating between the various actors in their foreign policy and security policy bureaucracies. Chinese friends will be the first to tell you that the Chinese policy coordination system is bedeviled by turf-conscious bureaucracies, stovepipe processes, and a culture of poor horizontal communications. There really is no interagency coordinating mechanism for daily foreign policy and security mechanisms in China as we think of them here in the U.S. or in other places in the West. So poor coordination is a stressor. And a third stressor, I think, is the fact that we have many, many more actors in China involved in foreign policy and security affairs. Bureaucratic actors such as provincial and municipal governments and the globally peripatetic state-owned enterprises are increasingly engaged in parochial activities abroad that are causing the center in Beijing to have to work much, much harder to align the interests and policies of so many players. And so what is the implication of all of this? Well, given the systemic challenges that the Chinese party state is having along these lines, we can probably expect to see more examples of apparent disconnects between stated Chinese policies from the center in Beijing and, in some cases, actual behavior on the ground by some Chinese bureaucratic entities. We probably have not seen the last of left-hand, right-hand disconnects, such as the January 2007 anti-satellite test or other instances that we could mention. And so these disconnects have the potential, inadvertently, to cause tensions in China's relations, not just with the U.S., but with other countries around the world. So we have a system that's under stress. A third major point of new context has to do, of course, with the Chinese military. After many years of military modernization, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is finally coming onto line as a credible operational asset available to support Beijing's larger national security objectives in the Asia-Pacific region. And while the Taiwan scenario continues to be a major driver of what the PLA is trying to be prepared to do, today Chinese military modernization is not only about Taiwan. Back in 2004, Hu Jintao issued to the Chinese military what they call the new historic missions, in which they were told for the first time that their mission is not just to defend the party and to defend China's sovereignty, but to defend Chinese interests. Where sovereignty is tied to geography, Friends of mine in the PLA like to point out that interests are not tied to geography. So today, for the first time in its history, the PLA is going places and doing things, and such as its ongoing anti-piracy operations off the Horn of Africa, and most people don't realize that China provides more blue helmet peacekeepers to UN peacekeeping operations than any other Security Council member in the UN. So we have what we have here is a PLA that is finally starting to move a little bit. So no, I don't think that the PLA is yet a global military and a military that can sustain conventional force as we think of it here in the U.S., but the PLA is becoming what I like to refer to as an incipient expeditionary force. You're going to see the PLA in other places around the world. Implications of this: an operationally capable Chinese military that can project force beyond China's borders, especially in the maritime and aerospace dimensions, is a major geostrategic development in the Asia-Pacific region. The acquisition of nuclear weapons by North Korea and the modernization of the PLA, I think, are the two real big stories of Asian-Pacific security over the last 20 to 30 years. And so for the first time since the end of the Cold War, there is a credible military in the region that is not part of the U.S. alliance and defense partnership system. And this is a military that has a very different view about what constitutes transparency, a military that has a different view about what constitutes confidence-building measures, and a military with very little experience in operating in close proximity to other foreign militaries. So needless to say, this development comes with some concerns and question marks throughout the region and in other places in the world. And fourth and last major point of new context, and I think this is more in tune with the theme of this larger conference, I think that every country now has a stake, a national security interest in how Beijing handles its own domestic challenges, many of which Martin alluded to in his opening comments. Because of China's integration into the international community, some of Beijing's domestic policy choices will affect the rest of us just by default. And some of those domestic challenges are going to be magnified to a certain degree and exported abroad in our current interconnected and hyper-globalized world. So what are some of these issues? Let me just mention four before I conclude. First, consumer safety challenges. And most of these have to do with human security, by the way, human security. Consumer safety challenges. In 2007, American and Chinese consumers came face to face with the issues associated with consumer safety. We went through the tainted pet food crisis, the toothpaste issue, the dangerous toy recall, questions about the safety of Chinese manufactured pharmaceuticals such as heparin, and of course the Chinese, tragically at home, grappled with tainted baby formula, which was a real heartbreaker if you were following the stories out there. So clearly both Americans and Chinese and all people in the world now have common stake in ensuring that product safety standards are upheld, whether it's at the design end here in the U.S. or in the manufacturing end out in China. Second, and I know you've talked about this, environmental challenges. China's environmental challenges only seem to get worse every year. And China's pollution is not just China's problem anymore. The winds traveling east from Asia are carrying Chinese pollutants to the Western Hemisphere. Los Angeles city officials were in the newspapers a couple of years ago complaining that on some of their bad air days, up to 25%, how they came up with that I don't know, but they claim that up to 25% of the particulate pollutants over LA were coming from China. We simply will not be able to deal with the global environmental concerns that we all have without engaging Chinese friends. So we've got to get them on board with this, as well as the U.S., because the U.S. and China, of course, are the two greatest emitters of greenhouse gases. Third, public health challenges. Medical professionals believe that the next global influenza pandemic is not a matter of if, but when. And it is clear that southern China is one of the petri dishes in which that next strain is probably reassorting. And given past experiences with SARS and H5N1, we can appreciate that Beijing has the potential to either help mightily or greatly hinder global efforts to contain the next international health crisis. We simply have to work more and more with our Chinese friends through the international public health organizations to bring them into line and up to standard. And I think they get it. After SARS, I think they really do get it. And finally, law enforcement issues. One of the darker results of 30 years of breakneck economic modernization in China has been the resurfacing of criminal activity in China that reaches far beyond China's shores. U.S. and international law enforcement organizations have an increasing interest in being able to work with their Chinese counterparts on, because the PRC is now one of several global centers of international crime that include human trafficking, drug smuggling, organized crime, environmental crimes, rare species smuggling. We could go on and on. We have a Chinese issue. So to conclude, where does this leave the U.S.-China security situation? Well, at bottom, I think we need to understand that the U.S.-China security relationship is going to defy simple characterization. It's going to continue to be a relationship comprised of a very tangled and messy web of issue sets that, on the one hand, impel the two countries to work together out of sheer selfish national interest, but on the other hand, an group of issue sets that are going to compel these two to be engaged in some contentious relationships. There are some unhappy stories out there. So overall, I see that in the near term, I see problems potentially on the horizon for the U.S.-China security relationship on traditional security, yet I see tremendous rays of hope in the policies of both countries in working together on non-traditional security. So the question I'll leave the group with is whether or not either or both countries will be able to bring forth leaders with the wisdom to be able to properly manage those areas where we have serious disagreement and expand those areas where we absolutely must cooperate. Thanks.
Dave, that was absolutely terrific. I'm going to pick up right where you left off, and I will be brief and therefore superficial, but that's never bothered me at all. Years ago, a wise man from the East told me that if something is worth doing, it's worth doing superficially. He was from the East Coast of the United States. There is now no international relationship of greater consequence than that between China and America. There will be no G2, but how our two countries manage our relations will make a decisive difference, not just to our future, but to that of the world. More than any other single factor, what happens between Beijing and Washington will decide whether the 21st century is tranquil or turbulent. It will determine whether the United States, China, and the global economy briskly prosper and advance or dwindle in feeble repose. It will have a major bearing on whether the world's monetary and financial systems regain solvency and are able to support continued trade and investment growth. It will facilitate or impede the management of global climate change and environmental remediation, the stewardship of energy, food, and mineral supplies, the updating of international law to accommodate new realities, and the emergence of more effective systems of global governance than we now possess. And it will drive our respective relationships with other rising or reviving powers like India, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia, maybe even Brazil and the EU. China's leaders clearly understand what's at stake. Across the global and regional amphitheaters, with rare lapses, they have been playing a prudent, patient, low-risk game. It's less clear that Americans, who are far less risk-averse than Chinese, quite grasp what the consequences of messing up our interactions with China might be. America has been playing different games in different arenas. We are lawyerly and cautious on trade and currency matters. We are demanding and sometimes petulant on political questions, and increasingly adventuresome, even bellicose, on military issues. The message this sends is mixed. It enables Chinese to hear the worst if that's what they want to hear. Many do. lots of people in China imagine that the United States is determined to keep their country down and to deny it the role and influence in its region to which its history, size, and achievements entitle it. There are not a few Americans who apply the same techniques of selective listening and conspiracy theorizing to China. Their suspicions are inflamed by a small army, well, anyway, a couple of squads of pundits and polemicists determined to unearth the ghost of Fu Manchu in today's China. As some in this audience may recall, the fictional Dr. Fu was an evil genius prone to dispatching the targets of his wrath with crafty criminal deceptions, inscrutably arcane methods, and astonishingly peculiar weaponry. In the imagination of an increasing number of U.S. securocrats and military planners, not to mention Hollywood screenwriters, someone like Dr. Fu now directs Chinese strategy. This interpretation of China's intentions and capabilities is at least as neurotic as China's distorted image of America, and it's equally harmful. Self-fulfilling paranoia is not a sound basis for cooperative relations between nations. In our own respective national interests, as Dave mentioned, China and America need to cooperate with each other. In point of fact, despite the problems in our mutual perceptions, I'd argue that the prospects for our doing so are not bad at all. This is because the possible causes of conflict between us are receding. The need to cooperate is increasingly compelling, and the opportunities to accomplish things together are ever more obvious. China is adjusting its economic model, in which investment and exports drove growth, to stress consumption in domestic markets. Its global trade surplus shrank to around 2.7% of its GDP in 2011, the lowest ratio in more than a decade. This is close to the 4%, this is actually below the 4% level that the U.S. Treasury considers a sign of an undervalued currency. Meanwhile, China is moving quite rapidly toward the internationalization of the renminbi yuan and allowing it to trade more freely. Over the decades since China entered the World Trade Organization, or WTO, it's been by far the fastest growing export market in the world for U.S. goods and services. In recent years, U.S. exports to China have been growing at an annual average of 21%. They're projected to continue to rise at a much faster rate than imports during the rest of this decade as China overtakes the United States as the world's largest market. China and America are now married to each other economically. As anyone who is married can attest, interdependence, even affectionate interdependence, begets bickering. It's an election year in the United States. In such years, we are accustomed to politicians bloviating, blaming foreigners for all our ills, and belaboring yesterday's problems as though they were tomorrow's. It's already clear that 2012 will be no exception to this general practice. We're hearing a lot about China, but the point is that much of what has or will be said has been or is being overtaken by events. Of course, as the issues shift, the political whining and posturing will just change focus. But barring extraordinary lapses of judgment by one or the other of us, the United States and China seem destined to become more, not less, intimate. The world economy will be the better for that, and so will both of us. Despite our bilateral frictions, China and America have a common interest in achieving a smooth transition to a new financial and monetary order. The existing dollar-dependent system is in a state of decay that threatens the well-being of developed and newly wealthy nations alike. We can manage change, or we can wait for it to impose itself. Either way, change is coming. Within a decade, China's economy will begin to become larger than America's by a widening margin. IMF says 2018 at nominal exchange rates. That will happen. Might be wrong, but it's going to happen sooner than many people imagine. At the same time, the gap between America and other nations will narrow. To achieve renewed financial security for the world, the international monetary system and its institutions need to evolve. China and other rising economies must begin to play roles in sustaining the stability of the global economic commons commensurate with the benefits that they derive from them. Americans have long understood that Taiwan could produce a bloody rendezvous for us with Chinese nationalism. No one's ever been able to come up with any reason other than Taiwan for China and America to have a war. But the question of what sort of relationship Taiwan ought to have with the rest of China is something that Taipei and Beijing now seem to be doing pretty well at working out between themselves. The danger of war over Taiwan is clearly receding. And though some have attempted to portray disputes between China and some of its neighbors over small islands, rocks, and reefs in the East and South China Seas as the fulcrum of global geopolitics, this is unconvincing to all but dedicated warmongers and thriller junkies. Fortunately, warmongers are a tiny minority in both China and America, and thriller junkers mostly don't make policy. I won't say there aren't some of them in there doing that. But despite the best efforts of the military-industrial complexes on both sides to try to gin up a rationale for military confrontation that could inflate defense budgets, such confrontation remains as unlikely as it is unnecessary. In this connection, let me close with a thought on the so-called pivot to the Indo-Pacific, or the pirouette, as some think it may turn out to be, or the rebalancing and rotation of America's strategic tires, or whatever it is. It seems entirely natural to me that the countries of Asia should seek the reassurance of strong ties with the United States as they accommodate the reality of rising Chinese power. Confidence on their part is good for stability, which is a prerequisite for the peaceful international environment China requires for its stability, for its domestic tranquility and development. And the United States also needs such stability as a Pacific power. China recognizes the contribution of an American presence in the Asia-Pacific to the peace of the region and has not opposed it. But if the American purpose is now to prevent rather than ease the inclusion of Chinese power in the regional balance, or America is seen to have that purpose, disharmony and confrontation between Chinese and Americans are a certainty. This would shape the course of events in this century to the disadvantage of both peoples and the world as a whole. Americans have been in the habit of demanding greater strategic transparency from China. In our own interest, we need to think carefully about American strategy and be more transparent about it to ourselves, China, and the world. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. First, I want to say to offer my deepest thanks for Kerry Foundation and East-West Institute to host such a wonderful and meaningful conference. And thanks for the invitation, inviting me. And I will also thank Dr. Livingston. Thank you for your recommendation. I want to say it's so great. It's so great to be here with so many prestigious ambassadors like Ambassador Freeman, who is very famous very well known in China, and professors and experts. For quite some time, I want to catch the theme of this conference and prepared for my speech. But as a young scholar, what I see, what I learn, and what I know are not enough to help me to give a comprehensive comment on what's happening in China and its implication for China-US relations and for the world even. So Dr. Lee's given me many good suggestions. Thank you very much. And listening to Ambassador Freeman's comments on China and China-US relations also encouraged me a lot. So thank you, Ambassador. And first of all, I want to talk about China attitude, the real attitude to the United States. For recent years, China as its economy grows very fast. So China is considered more and more assertive in international affairs. This is, I think, in my opinion, this is the key reason which has caused distrust and tensions between China and the United States. People always draw the conclusion of China's assertiveness mostly from some media's assertive articles or debates on China foreign policy. But is it the real attitude of Chinese to the world or to the United States? Here, I have 3 points to help you to understand the reality of China's attitude. First, my institute, my home institute, the Institute of American Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, has done some polls on China-US relations since 2008. Unfortunately, the poll results are released in Chinese. When I back, I will suggest them to do English edition. Maybe it's helpful. The questionnaire survey covers Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Wuhan in central China, Lanzhou in northwest China, Harbin in northeast China, and Guangzhou in south China, as well Chongqing in west China. So cover all over the country. Here I just have the data in my computer of 2008 and 2010. Let me do a simple comparison. In 2008, when the recession began to appear in the United States, 42% of Chinese still believe American economic power will maintain the status quo, will maintain powerful, will maintain the number 1. 20% believe the American economy will go into weak slowly. This is in 2008. And only 2.4% think it might be go weak quickly. So on the role of the United States in world affairs, almost half, that's 48% Chinese believe that the crisis, the recession, the economic recession will not reduce its influence. No more than 20% believe American power will be weakened. On perspective of Chinese-US relations, 45% are optimistic. 30% believe in status quo. Only 4% felt pessimistic. On the policy choice on Chinese policy choice toward the United States, 11% suggested assertive, and 32% suggested moderate assertive. 42% suggested flexible. This is the poll result of 2008. In 2010 poll, over half of percent, 53% believe that the United States has the same influence as before, although they have an economic recession. 20% believe its influence is up, and 21% believe its influence has been reduced by the economic recession. On the importance of China-US relations, more than 90% 90% Chinese believe it is important. Only 1.3% believe it's not important. On the perspective of China-US relations, more than 70, in 2010, more than 70 are optimistic. Among them, 63% believe there will be ups and downs, but better and better in the future. 15% believe there will be no changes. Only 4.5 are pessimistic. So there is also, that's the attitude. There is also a phenomenon that should be noticed in nowadays China. Most people in China now still take America as their priority of study and tourism. Due to China's poor educational system and status, more and more parents believe the United States is the paradise for their children and would rather send their children to study here to follow American-style study. So that's the basic attitude of public. As for the policy makers, we should pay more attention on what have changed and what did not change in Beijing. From the documents released by the government, we can find Beijing actually has ceased to refer to U.S. foreign policy as seeking global hegemonism. Less and less mentioned the role of the United States as a global hegemonism. Also, China's reduced as its criticism of U.S. behavior seemed to be directly against China. More and more is about cooperation. Actually, while pursued different goals, China's official documents such as white papers on defense security even share the same common understanding on international situations with the American government documents. So, but now the media play a very, very, very negative role in the images of the two countries. The media is very confused in China now. Some newspapers and websites even always want to challenge policies and make challenging debates among policy analysis or policy research circles. This is really confused because people believe China's media is under the control of CPC. But on the other side, people also believe the media will reflect the public opinion. So actually, for the political reason and the historical reason, most media want to keep consistent with the central propaganda department of CPC. So, but on the other side, they have to do something maverick to attract readers and then achieve commercial goals. So China's media has no commercial goals before the reform and the opening up, because at that time the government supported all medias. But now they must search for money for support, to support themselves. So they have commercial goals. So that's the fact that the goals of media contract sometimes. One hand, they must follow the CPC propaganda department's guideline. On the other hand, they must do something different, something unique to attract the public. So that's media. So that's as a result, the media always overstates the fact. I think the media, the other countries sometimes do the same thing. So, but in China, to overstate the facts is very easy to arouse nationalism among public. Nationalism is always easy to use in China because of the historical reasons. So anyway, whatever the attitude reflected in China now, we should bear in mind the reality so far of more and more cooperation between China and the U.S. in various fields and at various levels. While many conflicts, interests, and ideas exist between China and the United States, China recognized the fact of sharing important traits and ideas with the United States. Comparing the mounting pressure in China at home, the current international environment seems very good, seems benign, providing Beijing and Washington and other countries find ways to solve global issues and to achieve the goal of this conference, the cooperative security. So I do agree we should delete the question mark of the schedule. Okay, that's all. 谢谢。
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in this wonderful panel. I'm honored and very humbled to be a part of this distinguished group and to share the stage with folks whose writings I've read and admired and learned from for many years. In my brief comments, and I see the clock is already ticking, I'd like to talk about an aspect of U.S.-China relations that has been alluded to but not yet delved into, and that is the question of China as a factor in U.S. politics, and specifically the evolving politics of U.S.-China relations. I think it's a very topical issue to discuss as we talk about cooperative security between the United States and China, and as we sit here in the shadow of the United States Capitol with the great view that we have. What I'd like to do is talk about four things. Number one, 2012 as a very special political year in the relationship. Number two, three key shifts in China as a factor in U.S. politics. Number three, I'd like to talk about four recent comments by major U.S. national political figures that illustrate these shifts. And then fourthly, I'll end with a few concluding comments. And I note that there's a Chinese propensity to use numbers to talk about groups of issues, the three communiques, the five principles of peaceful coexistence. So I'll talk about the three shifts and the four comments. In terms of 2012, I think what we have is clearly a very unique and significant year in the politics of U.S.-China relations. Obviously, in terms of the political calendars, the United States has a presidential election, which we're well into on the GOP primary side, in which it continues to unfold. And at the same time, later this year, the Chinese will be going through the first part of a kind of Texas two-step political transition, with the party transition taking place in October of this year, and then the national government transition taking place next year. I think it's worth noting that this convergence of a U.S. political season, a U.S. presidential election specifically, and the Chinese political transition is something that happens only once every 20 years. The last time this happened was in 1992. The next time it'll happen will be in 2032, and that's because the Chinese are on a 5-year cycle and we're on a 4-year cycle. Notably, in 1992, which was the last year in which these two events happened in the same year, there wasn't a shift in China because Jiang Zemin, who was in power and who came into power after Tiananmen in 1989, didn't leave high office, but rather continued in that high office and would continue as General Secretary, as President, and Chairman of the Central Military Commission for another 10 years beyond 1992. So this is really the first year in U.S. and Chinese history in which there is going to be a transition in China, and there could very well be a transition with the presidential election here, and I think that's very significant. What it means is that there are very significant political pressures being brought to bear on both the U.S. leadership and the Chinese leadership in a way that we have never seen in the modern history of U.S.-China relations. And I think that's something to keep in mind as we talk about the topic of this session, the notion of the U.S. and China being the pivotal relationship for cooperative security. Let me now move over to what I see as three key and I think very significant shifts in the way that China comes into the question of U.S. politics, and specifically the way it manifests itself in the context of U.S. presidential politics and a presidential campaign. In 1992, which was the first presidential election after Tiananmen, which occurred in 1989, the key issue vis-a-vis China in the U.S. presidential race was human rights. And in fact, 1992 was really the first issue in which China was a controversial topic in U.S. politics in sort of the post-Nixon era. And so it manifested itself as essentially a proxy for the question of human rights. And when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas and running for president, he really spoke a lot about human rights problems in China. He even referenced, as he put it, the butchers of Beijing. And this was the dominant theme, the dominant prism through which China was viewed and addressed in presidential discourse. But there's been an evolution in the way that China is framed and discussed in the context of U.S. presidential politics. And that's what I want to talk about now with reference to what I've referred to as the three shifts. The first shift is a shift from looking at China through the prism of human rights to looking at the China through the prism of economics, trade, and I would argue more broadly, national competition. And I think that's the most important idea. So whereas a generation ago and even into 2000 with the Gore-Bush election, China was viewed mostly through the context of human rights, today it is discussed almost exclusively by presidential candidates as an issue with respect to economics, trade, and competition. Number two, the second shift is a shift, and this I think is very significant and hasn't been commented upon much, and that is a shift at looking at China as a foreign policy issue toward looking at China as a domestic policy issue here in the United States. And that is a rather radical reframing of China in the U.S. political context. I'll give you some examples of that later. But if you think about the GOP debates which we've seen, and I've tried to watch just about all of them, perhaps about 24. I heard a few audible gasps in the audience, but it's very interesting. It's great insight into our politics. And what's remarkable is in those debates, China virtually never comes up in the foreign policy parts of the debates. And it never comes up. In fact, I think there was times when it just did not come up at all in debates that were marketed as foreign policy debates. Where it does come up is in issues like education, manufacturing, the loss of jobs, economic growth, trade, but insofar as the creation of U.S. jobs is concerned, and so on. So China in U.S. presidential politics is no longer a foreign policy issue. It is a domestic policy issue. And the third shift is China used to be a measuring stick for the toughness of presidential candidates. Now it has become a measuring stick for our national inadequacy. And we see this coming through a number of different remarks. But one interesting thing that I've tracked over the years is typically when U.S. presidential candidates talk about China, there is one word that is invariably, historically, invariably has been used within the same sentence, and that is the word tough. I'm going to get tough on China if you elect me president. My opponents aren't tough, but I'm tough. And if you look back at 2008, the last presidential race, you see the word tough coming out. It almost never comes out today, but instead, China is held up as a measuring stick not for a candidate's toughness, but rather for our nation's adequacy or inadequacy. Let me give you very briefly 4 quick comments that have been made by national political figures that I think bear out each of the shifts that I've talked about. First, in 2010, and I'll do this chronologically, Governor Rendell of Pennsylvania made a very interesting comment that I think is worth mentioning because I think it was the beginning of this different type of discussion of China at the national level. An NFL football game on Monday night was blizzarded out for the first time in the modern history of the NFL. And it prompted it was in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Eagles were hosting the Vikings, and Governor Rendell said, if this were China, they would have held the game. They would have had armies of volunteers coming to clean the streets of snow, and they would have been doing calculus problems as they did so. We have become a nation of wusses. That's what Governor Rendell said. A Democrat, by the way. The next comment that I think, or set of comments that was made that illustrate this notion of China as kind of existential competitor were the comments that President Obama made in the 2011 State of the Union address, where he basically referred again, strikingly, and I think for the first time in American history, at least in the modern era, he referred to China not in the foreign policy section of his State of the Union address, but rather in the domestic policy section, and he referred to China, and these are not his words but mine, but a close paraphrasing, as basically an existential competitive threat to the United States around the issues of education, manufacturing, economics, job creation, clean energy, and many of the issues that Martin alluded to right at the outset. And so the notion of China as existential competitive threat rather than as a discrete, compartmentalized foreign policy challenge is new. More recently, this year, Gingrich, former Speaker Gingrich, in his run for the White House, right after South Carolina as he was going to Florida, made the comment, and I'm paraphrasing closely, do we really want to let the Chinese be the first to colonize the moon? So he's talking about an enormous and significant domestic policy program, space, but with reference to the Chinese. And then most strikingly, and I save it for last and it's the most recent, was a comment made by Governor Romney, which has gotten very little attention. It's certainly been noted, but not in this sense. Governor Romney said, and I'm paraphrasing closely, if I become president, I will look at federal spending, $4 trillion of the federal U.S. budget, and I will weigh it against one question and one question alone. Is this national spending priority worth borrowing money from China? If it is, we do it. If it's not, we don't do it. Now, in my history of looking at U.S. presidential contests, I've never heard a candidate for office, until Governor Romney's remark, measure all federal spending dollars against the China test. Is it worth borrowing from China or is it not? That, my friends, I would suggest really gets at how deeply China has gotten into the American psyche and under our skin. Let me conclude with a few brief concluding comments, cognizant of our time limits here. I think discourse about U.S.-China relations is important because it has an impact not just on the tone, but on the substance of U.S.-China relations. As we look at the Capitol here, I'm reminded of a broader idea, and that is public policy outcomes can never be very far removed from the quality of public policy discourse. And if we have bumper sticker discourse, the likelihood is we're going to have bumper sticker solutions, which is another way of saying we're not going to have solutions to our problems. And if we have this kind of politicized rhetoric about China in our presidential politics, it's going to have an impact on the substance of foreign policy. I think what we see is an evolving narrative that is complicating relations and that is qualitatively different from the narrative that we have seen in U.S.-China relations up to now. It's not just about human rights, and in fact, oddly enough, it's really no longer just about foreign policy. It is about China as a presumed existential competitor to the United States. It's not about China as something that can be compartmentalized to the side, but rather China being a proxy for all that is potentially wrong with the United States. We've moved, in short, from we don't share, or they don't share our values, to a narrative of they're eating our lunch. We've moved from they're different from us to they're beating us. And that is, I think, a different dynamic in the discourse. It's one that is complicating the relationship. I don't think China or the United States are preordained to be either friends or foes. It will take effort to make them the former rather than the latter. And I think in this political season here, to say nothing of the political season in China, that work becomes more complicated in 2012 and 2013. And I think we all have our work cut out for us. Thank you very much.
Super. Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you feel that you've heard some pretty interesting insights from our distinguished panelists into this crucial relationship. I'm very pleased to tell you that our great leader has told us that we can carry on this discussion till 3:15, so we do have time for some questions, so please prepare your questions. While you're thinking, let me just make 2 points following all of this beautiful presentations. Ms. Wei, Victoria Wei, has explained to us Chinese attitudes, and it's extremely important to hear what she has to say. What I would say is the basically positive attitude is a tremendous potential for good relations, but in history things don't always work out smoothly. And it doesn't take much to provoke trouble. The Chinese are very sensitive because of their history to perceived insults, and they hear what these people say in the United States all the time. And they see what the US does, like the pivot to Asia and the Marines in Australia. They send very strong signals to China. So I don't think we should relax and think because their attitudes are basically positive, everything is fine. We have to be very careful not to provoke trouble. And the second thing I would mention is we haven't heard the word Europe in this discussion. And as a European, I simply need to say to you Americans to encourage you that we're also looking for money from China. And that we have a small fiscal problem ourselves. And the mood of our great leaders in Europe is we must be nice to the Chinese occasionally, especially when we go to Beijing looking for $5 or $10 billion to save the euro. So this is a worldwide problem, not only a US-China problem. In any event, I should just tell you the last thing. We're talking about this relationship as if it was limited to the China-US relation, but of course it extends into the wider world. One figure makes it clear. China-Africa trade in 1999 was $2 billion. China-African trade in 2010 was $130 billion. So China is moving, quite regardless of its relations with the US, across the world into many areas of investment and trade, which is a good thing in many respects, but it also opens up delicacies. So may I ask you now for questions to our distinguished panelists? And I must say the gentleman who is over 90 gets precedence. Mr. Bowling, please.
Mr. Bowling.
Wait for a microphone. Here's a microphone.
Use the
Microphone. Your microphone is there.
Oh, thank you. My name is Landon Bowling. I want to ask a question about the potential role of non-governmental organizations in the relationship with China. I ask this question partly out of my experience as a senior advisor to an international relief and development agency called Mercy Corps. We were encouraged by the U.S. government to get involved with the food problem in North Korea. Well, China was the entryway into North Korea, and it's indispensable in doing things that we're doing there. A few years ago, I was in Beijing and sat at a dinner with the head of one of the new NGOs in China, and they were wanting to learn from us as an American experience of how you do this, and they're working at this. And now just recently, a Chinese NGO has agreed to team up with Mercy Corps in doing work in Africa. Mm-hmm. Now, if we can be partners in humanitarian assistance to underdeveloped countries, that seems to me something that works for the security of both of us. I wonder what comments our panel would say to this business of the role of NGOs in the relationship.
Could I ask one panelist to pick that one up so we can move on? Chaz, I think you can do that.
I think the relationship between American, European, and other NGOs and counterparts in China is getting richer every day. The Chinese themselves have not completely developed a system for their own NGOs, and they need to work on that. but there are, I believe, now some 400,000 NGOs in China, Chinese NGOs, and there may be even more than that, given the fact that some are not properly registered. So I think this is a tremendous area for cooperation, particularly because very often governments, which are subject to political pressures, are unable to do things that need to be done and that can be done by civil society.
Thank you. More questions? You've asked several, so I'll ask you, please.
I hope thank you very much. I hope you'll have patience with a simple question. China's string of pearls policy is sort of lining up along that crucial energy corridor coming from the Persian Gulf, and I'm wondering if you guys see China's military capacity helping out with energy security, or that being a point of tension. I'm just wondering how you see that play out. Thank you.
Michael, is your question on the same kind of thing? No. Okay. Who would like to answer that? David?
Yeah, thanks for a great question. There's an assumption built into it that there is a string of pearls strategy that I think that's still open to question. But I think the basic premise is important, that the Chinese are increasingly worried about the security of the energy lanes of transportation, and there are debates going on in China right now about what they should do about it. You know, speaking to my friends in China, and Wei, you can tell me if this is right or wrong. More and more, my friends in China in the foreign policy and security communities say that for 30 years China has had a national economic strategy, but we have yet to have a national security strategy, and that Chinese foreign policy has been based on principles lining up with interests, not on real ends, ways, means calculations. So I think there's a debate going on right now as to whether or not some of Deng Xiaoping's time-honored maxims for what China should and should not do to protect its own interests abroad are being subject to question.
A few footnotes. The string of pearls is an invention of Booz Allen Hamilton, not the Chinese General Staff Department.
Quite correct.
And the second point is that as the largest trading nation in the world, China now has a larger stake in freedom of navigation than any other country. And the third point is that if indeed the United States is going to have to not only do more with less, but will be doing less with less in the future, then we need partners. And this is indeed one area where it's not unreasonable to ask the Chinese to share part of the burden of ensuring that the global energy trade is unimpeded.
Thank you.
Well, did
Michael?
he mention he's from Booz Allen?
Oh, yeah, no, he didn't.
Michael Clare?
Yes, thank you. And this is a question for Charles, but anybody could answer it. Charles, you said, and I think persuasively, that the authentic possibility of military clashes arising in the South China Sea or elsewhere are very low for very genuine reasons. But the last presentation we just heard spoke about this emotional feeling in the United States, which I sense when I travel around speaking, that we are in this kind of existential competitive struggle with China. And I think that does have a way of flowing into the security dimension. So to what degree are the two likely to, one to fuel the other? That is to say, that this kind of psychological, emotional anxiety about China lead to a stronger military stance that will develop a momentum of its own?
I think there are hotheads in both countries. And as Ms. Wei indicated, they have access to the media. The Chinese might think that the New York Post speaks for the United States or the American people, but I doubt anybody in this room quite sees it that way. Similarly, Huanqiu Shibao, the infamous Global Times, speaks for a section of Chinese opinion, but not a majority, and it's trying to sell newspapers, just as the Post is. So there are hotheads who are in the public and in the media but they're cool heads who run the countries. And that's what we elect them or allow them to lead us for, to be rational actors and to be cool. What is at stake in the South China Sea is in most respects trivial. It is not an adequate cause for either side to risk a major military clash with the other. We could, of course, stumble into an accidental clash, and I agree with you, there is a danger in emotional, nationalistic, which is what I think Mr. Farstein was describing, an American nationalist response to the rise of China and the psychologically disquieting elements of China in some respects already overtaking us and destined to overtake us in other ways in the future. This is disquieting. But it is also a very good reason to think, not emote.
So I have a few words about the 环球时报. The Global Times now in China, it is said, itself is said it's the best seller in China, the newspaper, but it is widely criticized. It's widely criticized because it's always aroused debate. Debate also seems irrational, and also it is said its headlines. The headlines often is not consistent with the content. So that's
I have one question from the young lady over there, and then I fear we have to stop.
I have a question for Mr. Feinstein. I think you made a very interesting observation that in the American political discourse, China is no longer a foreign policy issue. It's becoming more of a domestic issue. And you also commented that it reflects how deeply China has gotten under our skin. But I want to push you further, or the rest of the panel further, and ask, the shifts you talk about, what do they mean for both governments on managing a cooperative U.S.-China relationship?
David, would you have a go of that, and then we must stop.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the question, and hopefully my mic is on and you can hear me. I think it's a very good question, and one that we don't really know the answer to, because U.S. political figures now are talking about China in a way that is different from before, qualitatively. In 1992, when Bill Clinton was running for president and really hitting China hard on human rights, it was jarring to Chinese observers of the United States who were still just beginning to develop kind of an understanding of how our politics work. Over the years, and in my experience, Chinese observers of the United States have gotten to be very sophisticated in their understanding of campaign rhetoric. And so now Chinese understand that when a candidate is on the stump talking about human rights or talking about getting tough on trade, they understand how to read it and interpret it, and they understand that the likelihood is, as Ambassador Freeman was quite rightly noting, cooler heads tend to prevail once they get into positions of power. We've seen that with Bill Clinton himself. We saw it with George W. Bush. To a degree, we've seen that with Barack Obama. He was rather critical of China on the trade side and to a degree on human rights, and then as president understands what his responsibilities are. But this type of discourse is very different. This is no longer just sort of human rights or just foreign policy. This is China as, again, potentially an existential threat from a competition standpoint to the United States. And my understanding, based on discussions with Chinese analysts who have been looking at this, is that this rhetoric is new and people are still trying to grapple with how to really understand it. The fact that Governor Romney would talk about measuring budget expenditures and our budget against the China question, is it worth borrowing from China from? That's a qualitatively different type of discourse. What I do think longer term, from what we can see now, is that the likelihood is U.S.-China relations are going to be somewhat more complicated because it's going to be more difficult to kind of think of China merely as a foreign policy issue that's out there to the side. It has been framed by the most influential American leaders, including President Obama himself, probably none more so than President Obama, as front and center on the American domestic agenda, permeating U.S. public policy discourse on education, on clean energy, on economic security, on jobs, manufacturing, trade. It's deep into U.S. discourse, and I think that is going to have a complicating effect over time, and we're in a qualitatively new period of political discourse in U.S.-China relations.
Thank you. Chaz, one word.
If we are, as David has said, and I believe he's right, moved into an era in which we see China as a formidable competitor, the question is our response to try to tear China down, which we can't do, or is it to try to make ourselves more competitive? And I hope it's the latter, that we really need to get our act together in this country, and China is a spur to that, potentially, and we should welcome that competition.
Well, I would like to thank all the panelists for their very wonderful contributions and all you in the audience for your questions. I think we could probably conclude that the chances of it being a positive relationship are very good if neither side does anything stupid. I would only add, if you extrapolate into the future and see the scale of the demand for resources emerging from China's doubling its economy, these tensions are going to grow. So confidence building and trust building is the name of the game, so that the system can bear the stresses which it's going to be exposed to. I now ask you to thank the panel.
All right, that's it. Well done. Thank you very much, Martin. Just to say